Have you ever looked into your child's eyes and felt like they're no longer there, as if some part of their soul got lost somewhere between childhood and adulthood? This isn't about teenage rebellion or a passing phase. This is about a silent emotional collapse, one that freezes inner growth, blocks affection, and distorts human connection. The question few dare to ask is, when did it start? And more importantly, what does your role have to do with it? Freud taught us that trauma doesn't scream, it whispers. It hides in repeated gestures, in uncomfortable silences, in the hugs that never happen. A child's mind is not a blank slate but a minefield of unconscious impressions. And when these impressions are ignored, suppressed, or misunderstood, they don't disappear. They rot from within. What you see as apathy, aggression, or detachment may only be the surface, the tip of an iceberg built by 7 psychic forces that are crushing your child's emotional vitality. Have you ever wondered why your child avoids touch, rejects conversation, or isolates so easily? That's not just behavior, it's a symptom, a reflex of something that broke long ago, perhaps in early childhood, perhaps in a moment you can't even recall. Freud called this psychic fixation, an invisible prison where parts of the self remain frozen in time, unable to evolve. The child grows in body, but emotionally they remain trapped. Repeating pain becomes more familiar than healing. And the cruelest part of all, in most cases what cripples a child's soul isn't the cruelty of strangers, it's the unconscious absence of those meant to protect them. Excessive control, emotional neglect, projected expectations. These form the fertile soil where emotional paralysis takes root. You don't have to scream at a child to break them. All it takes is to not see them for who they are. Today, we'll dive into the 7 underground forces that, according to Freud, may be paralyzing your child's emotional development. Be prepared to confront uncomfortable truths, revisit memories you thought were buried, and look at your own actions with new eyes. Because this video isn't about your child. It's about the unconscious that shaped them, and about the power you still hold to stop this cycle before it's too late. Every child is born with a natural impulse to love, to trust, and to surrender to the world. But that impulse is delicate. It doesn't grow on its own. It must be welcomed, mirrored, and returned. Freud called this the primary affective environment, the symbolic space where the self takes shape in response to the gaze of the other. When this environment is marked by emotional absence, coldness, neglect, or even a distorted, overbearing presence, the child doesn't learn to feel safe. The self does not evolve freely, it develops defensively. Love becomes surveillance, a hug becomes a test, and very early, the child learns to hide from connection. Imagine a castle built in a war zone. This is how the unconscious of a traumatized child constructs itself, not to flourish, but to survive. And within this fortress of defense, a silent wound begins to form. Freud warned that what cannot be felt will be repeated. Childhood trauma doesn't vanish. It disguises itself as emotional rigidity, detachment, even premature arrogance. The child rejects bonds before understanding them because affection was once invasive and care was once control. What looks like coldness may simply be fear dressed as strength. Here emerges the first psychological toxin, identification with the emotional aggressor. When a child realizes they cannot fight back, they adapt, becoming like the one who wounded them. Not out of choice, but out of psychic necessity. They silence their feelings, monitor their expressions, observe without engaging. Freud explained that the unconscious absorbs behavioral models, not through logic, but through emotional imprinting. And what scars the child is not just what is done to them, it's what is repeated in silence, day after day. They internalize abandonment long before they have the language to name it. Over time, this invisible pattern becomes an armor. The child grows up, but remains imprisoned by an emotional script they don't even know they're performing. They avoid intimacy, resist authority, live on high alert. Parents often interpret this as rebellion or ingratitude, but Freud compels us to see something else. This child isn't choosing distance. They're surviving a battlefield within. What you call withdrawal may be the echo of an inner world that's still bleeding. The tragedy is, if this cycle is not interrupted, It repeats itself. What the parents fail to heal in themselves, they unconsciously pass on as a psychic inheritance. Freud reminds us that every symptom is a message from the past, begging to be heard, and your child's behavior, as confusing as it may seem, might be just that, a silent scream asking for translation, for presence, for reconnection. Understanding that scream is the first step, but to truly hear it, you must first have the courage to look inward before you ever look at them. The second force that cripples the child from within is born not from violence, but from idealization. Freud taught us that the image of the parent is the first mirror in which the child searches for meaning, not just about the world, but about themselves. When this mirror reflects only expectations, perfection, or subtle disappointment, the child begins to fracture internally. They learn, often unconsciously, that love is something to be earned through obedience, silence, or performance. Slowly, the authentic self becomes a threat, and so it is buried. In its place grows a false self, one designed to please, to adapt, to avoid rejection. This false self becomes the child's armor and prison. They become masters at reading emotional cues, anticipating needs, shaping themselves into what others want to see. From the outside, they may appear compliant, intelligent, even gifted, but inside, the unconscious is at war. The real self, the one that feels anger, jealousy, confusion, desire, is banished into the shadows. Freud named this process repression, the exile of unacceptable truths into the unconscious, where they fester and distort future relationships. What looks like a well-adjusted child may in fact be a ghost of who they could have been. As this pattern deepens, the child becomes addicted to approval. Praise replaces intimacy. Achievement becomes a substitute for love, and when they fail, as all humans inevitably do, the collapse is brutal. They feel unworthy, invisible, even ashamed of their existence. Freud believed that neurosis often emerges from this internal split, the eternal tension between what we are and what we were forced to become. And the worst part? The child doesn't even know this is happening. They believe the mask is their face. They no longer remember what it means to feel without fear. Over time, this repression leads to the third wound, the inhibition of desire. Freud saw desire as the driving force of the psyche, not just sexual but existential. When a child learns that wanting is dangerous, they begin to amputate parts of themselves. They stop asking, they stop dreaming, they stop reaching for what lights them up. Instead, they settle for what is safe, predictable, and acceptable. They learn to survive by shrinking. And this self-shrinkage becomes so ingrained that even joy begins to feel suspicious. Desire, once repressed, does not disappear. It mutates. It reappears as anxiety, addiction, or an unexplainable emptiness. The danger here is subtle but devastating. The child loses touch with their inner compass. They no longer trust their instincts, their impulses, or their longings. They live through the eyes of others. Freud called this phenomenon alienation of the ego, a loss of self that begins in childhood but haunts every adult relationship. And as they grow older, they may sabotage love, success, or happiness, not because they don't want it, but because a buried part of them believes they don't deserve it. This is not rebellion. It's the unconscious clinging to the logic of its early wounds. And it cannot be healed with discipline, only with deep recognition. The fourth reason your child may be emotionally crippled lies in a psychic paradox Freud called ambivalence. The child experiences love and pain from the same source, the caregiver. One moment the parent nurtures, the next they neglect, scold, or withdraw. This inconsistency is poison to the forming mind. It teaches the child that love is unstable, unpredictable, dangerous. And so they split their emotions to survive. They love and hate you at once. They seek closeness, but push you away. Not because they are confused, but because they are protecting the parts of themselves you once accidentally harmed. This ambivalence doesn't vanish with time. It calcifies into adult behaviors, relationships marked by fear of abandonment, emotional roller coasters, and mistrust of intimacy. The child who was once torn between clinging and fleeing grows into the adult who sabotages closeness the moment it feels real. Freud observed that such individuals carry an unconscious script. If I get too close, I will get hurt. This belief governs their relationships from behind the curtain, and those around them are left confused, often feeling blamed for wounds they never inflicted, wounds that predate them by years. In this terrain, the fifth wound takes root. The child becomes the caretaker. When the parent is emotionally unstable, depressed, anxious, or self-absorbed, the child often reverses roles. They become the listener, the comforter, the emotional sponge. They learn that their worth lies in being useful, calming, or invisible. Freud called this inversion parentification, a distortion of boundaries that forces the child to abandon their developmental needs to protect the fragile adult. What's praised as maturity is actually trauma in disguise. These children grow up fast, but not whole. The cost of this role reversal is immense. The child learns to ignore their own emotions, deny their needs, suppress their pain. They become experts at scanning others' moods, adjusting themselves to maintain peace, and absorbing blame that doesn't belong to them. Freud would argue that their unconscious becomes a reservoir of unprocessed grief. And grief, when ignored, becomes depression, anxiety, or physical illness. You might see a responsible, helpful child, but behind that there may be a soul who never learned what it's like to simply be cared for. And the most tragic consequence? These children often choose relationships as adults that mirror this original imbalance. They seek out partners who need saving. They stay in dynamics where their needs are secondary. They confuse love with self-sacrifice, not because they're weak, but because they were trained to believe that love means abandoning the self. Freud knew, we repeat what we do not repair. And unless the original wound is acknowledged, the cycle continues, polished on the outside, hollow on the inside. The sixth psychic injury is perhaps the most invisible, and therefore the most dangerous. It is the betrayal of emotional truth. When a child expresses sadness, anger, or fear and is told, "Stop crying, don't be silly," or "You're too sensitive," they receive a devastating message. Your feelings are wrong. In Freud's language, this is the suppression of the primary process, the raw, honest expression of the unconscious. The child learns not to feel, but to perform, not to express, but to suppress. Slowly, they disconnect from their inner world. They no longer know what they feel, only what is acceptable to feel. This emotional invalidation teaches the child to doubt their perception of reality. They become anxious, indecisive, overly compliant. They no longer trust their emotions because they were taught those emotions were problems, not messages. Freud believed that when the inner voice is silenced, the unconscious finds other ways to speak, through psychosomatic symptoms, phobias, or compulsions. These are not random. They are encrypted cries for help born from years of emotional censorship. What the mouth was not allowed to say, the body now screams. Even worse, the child may begin to gaslight themselves. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe it wasn't that bad. Maybe it's my fault. This self-doubt is not weakness, it's conditioning. Freud called it reaction formation. The mind creates the opposite emotion to mask the forbidden one. Love hides anger. Cheerfulness covers despair. And slowly the child becomes a stranger to themselves. You see politeness, obedience, even resilience, but inside, a storm brews with no name and no exit. And here, in this emotional vacuum, emerges the seventh wound, the collapse of meaning. Freud believed that the human psyche needs coherence, a narrative, a sense of why things happen. When a child is surrounded by chaos, inconsistency, or dishonesty, they cannot make sense of their experience. They feel lost, fragmented, disconnected from both self and world. They may not articulate it, but the feeling is clear. Nothing makes sense, and nothing is safe. This existential insecurity becomes the backdrop of their entire life. This final fracture doesn't just affect the child's emotions, it distorts their identity. They begin to believe they are the problem, that their very being is flawed. Freud would say that the superego and the internalized voice of judgment becomes cruel, punishing, relentless. The child grows up under a tyrant that lives within them, echoing all the voices that once denied their pain. They may become high achievers, people pleasers, or emotional exiles, but inside they carry a haunting emptiness, a longing not just to be loved, but to be understood. The child who grows under the weight of these 7 psychic wounds does not become an adult. They become a defense mechanism in human form. Every smile is measured, every silence is armored, every relationship is filtered through layers of fear, control, and unconscious repetition. Freud warned us, the unresolved past does not stay buried, it seeks return. It repeats itself in our choices, in our partners, in our children. And for the emotionally crippled child, adulthood is not freedom. It is the stage where the internal war becomes external drama. As this child matures, they may begin to sabotage intimacy without knowing why. They withdraw just when love gets too close. They create chaos to avoid vulnerability. They chase perfection as a way to escape the unbearable feeling of being seen. Freud described this as the return of the repressed, the unconscious forcing unresolved conflicts to surface through behavior. And this behavior often confuses both the sufferer and those who love them. Why does success feel empty? Why does love trigger fear? Why does peace feel unsafe? These are not flaws, they are echoes. And in this echo, the parent, perhaps you, may begin to feel guilt. But Freud's insights are not meant to shame. They are meant to liberate. To understand the roots of a child's emotional paralysis is not to blame yourself. It is to reclaim the power to change. Because the unconscious only governs our lives when we refuse to make it conscious. The moment you name the wound, it begins to lose its grip. And that's where healing begins, not in denying the past, but in finally turning toward it with open eyes. It's tempting to search for quick fixes, therapy, medication, discipline. But Freud challenges us to go deeper. The emotionally crippled child does not need to be corrected, they need to be seen. Their symptoms are not defects, but coded messages from a buried self. To reach that self, one must listen without judgment, reflect without fear, and respond without control. This requires a different kind of strength, not the strength to fix, but the strength to witness, to sit in discomfort, to walk beside them through the fog of their own psyche. And perhaps the most profound act of love you can offer is not advice nor solutions, but presence. Freud believed that insight alone was not enough. Transformation requires experience. When the child begins to feel safe enough to exist without performance, to speak without being shut down, to feel without being punished, only then can the psychic knots begin to unravel. Healing is not loud. It is quiet, slow, and deeply relational. But once it begins, the shift is irreversible, because the unconscious, once illuminated, cannot return to the dark. But what happens if we don't listen? If we dismiss these signs as phases or personality quirks? Freud was unequivocal. The price of repression is paid with interest. The emotionally crippled child becomes the emotionally avoidant adult, or the explosive one. They live in extremes because they never learned the balance of regulated emotion. Joy feels foreign. Sadness feels dangerous. Anger becomes either a weapon or a secret, and inside the psyche grows tired, because holding back the truth every day is a form of psychic labor, and no one can sustain it forever. The result is often internal collapse. What Freud called neurosis may now be called anxiety, depression, burnout, but the root is the same, the soul suffocating under its own silence. These individuals may function well in society, get good grades, land good jobs, raise good families, but inside they feel like imposters, detached, disconnected. Freud noted that this disconnection from one's own emotional reality is not just painful, it is dehumanizing. You begin to exist but not to live, to respond but not to feel, to achieve but not to belong. And here lies a terrifying truth. If we don't heal, we transfer. The child who was never allowed to be angry may become the parent who cannot tolerate their child's frustration. The one who was emotionally abandoned may abandon without realizing it, not through absence, but through emotional unavailability. Freud understood this transgenerational transmission of trauma, What is not spoken is passed on. What is not healed is reenacted. The emotionally crippled child grows into the emotionally confusing parent. And the cycle continues until someone chooses to stop. Stopping the cycle does not mean having all the answers. It means breaking the rule of silence. It means daring to ask the questions that were never asked in your own childhood. What did I need that I never received? What feelings did I learn to bury? What truth did I carry for someone else? Freud believed the path to healing was through self-knowledge, brutal, honest, raw self-knowledge. Only when we see our own unconscious clearly can we create space for our child's psyche to breathe, to speak, to evolve. And so, the invitation is this. Before you try to change your child, dare to meet the child you once were. The one who cried in silence. The one who never felt safe enough to be messy, needy, flawed, because that child still lives within you, and they are the bridge to your empathy. When you embrace that inner child, you become capable of offering what you never received. And in doing so, you become not just a parent, but a liberator of generations. There comes a moment, often quiet, when a child looks at the parent not with admiration, but with distance. The warmth is gone. The spark is faded. Conversations become mechanical. You feel them slipping away, and yet you don't know how to pull them back. Freud would say this is not the moment they stopped loving you. It's the moment their defense became stronger than their desire. They didn't choose disconnection. They were trained to numb it, layer by layer, until it became reflex. And now love feels dangerous again. What do you do when your child stops talking to you? When every question feels like an intrusion and every answer is hollow? Freud's answer was not discipline, but decoding. Every withdrawal is a message, every silence is a defense, and every defense is a symptom of pain. If you try to break the wall with pressure, it will grow taller. But if you approach with curiosity, not accusation, the wall may lower. The emotionally crippled child does not need you to fix them. They need you to finally hear them, and hearing is not the same as reacting. Freud insisted on the power of the analytic posture, a stance of non-interference, patient observation, radical empathy. To adopt this with your child means to become a witness, not a judge, to make space, not impose order, to listen, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts, because what your child may say is not what you want to hear. It may sound unfair, exaggerated, even hostile, but it is their truth, and until that truth is allowed to live, they will continue to die silently inside. Healing, Freud believed, begins when the unconscious is made conscious, when the story that was lived in silence is finally told in words. And sometimes the simple act of saying, "I see you," or "I didn't know I hurt you," can be the key that unlocks years of frozen emotion. This isn't weakness, it is psychic responsibility. Because love without awareness is not love, it is projection, it is performance. And your child doesn't need a perfect parent. They need a present one who dares to feel, to fail, and to try again. What happens when a child feels seen? They begin to thaw. The defenses soften. The body relaxes. The eyes meet yours without fear. And slowly a new relationship is born, one that's not based on fear, guilt, or performance, but on presence, authenticity, and repair. Freud called this the working through, the process of digesting pain so that it no longer controls us. It is not quick, it is not easy, but it is real. And it is worth every uncomfortable conversation, every tear, every moment of truth. The emotionally crippled child may never say thank you. They may not write a letter of gratitude or give you a dramatic hug in the rain. Freud never promised cinematic healing. What he promised was this: the psyche remembers safety. It remembers being allowed to exist without fear. And when that experience is finally given, something ancient begins to shift. The child who once walked on eggshells may take their first true breath, not because you solved them, but because you finally made room for them to be whole. This is the paradox of parenting the wounded. The more you let go of control, the more influence you gain. The more you listen, the more they speak. The more you accept, the more they transform. Not by force, but by recognition. Freud's vision of healing was not external. It was intrapsychic. It was about the invisible dance between the ego, the id, and the superego, and how a safe relationship can realign what trauma once shattered. Perhaps your child will always carry scars, but scars are not signs of failure. They are signs of survival. Freud saw symptoms not as enemies but as coded wisdom. And when we decode them with love and courage, they can become maps. Maps that show us where we've been, and more importantly, how not to get lost again. Because to heal a child is not just to help them, it is to rewrite the future, to interrupt the chain of unconscious suffering, to offer the next generation something you never received, freedom from the invisible. So the question is not, what's wrong with my child? The question is, what are they trying to show me about myself? In that mirror, you may find answers you've been running from. You may also find the keys to connection, compassion, and clarity. Because healing is not linear, it is circular. What you give returns. What you feel frees. What you own no longer owns you. And what you see in your child, if you are brave enough, may become the path to your own liberation. And in the end, Freud would remind us, the goal is not to raise perfect children, it is to raise conscious ones. And that begins with one radical act, the courage to see beneath the behavior, to see through the silence, to see not the child you wanted, but the one who is still waiting to be understood. What we've explored here is not just a set of psychological theories, it is a mirror that many of us have avoided for years, sometimes decades. Freud did not create tools to judge. He revealed maps to understanding, and if you followed this journey until now, perhaps you felt something stir inside you. Maybe it was a memory, maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was a sense of recognition that your child's wounds speak a language your own heart secretly understands. That's not coincidence. That's the unconscious reaching for light. We began this story with a child emotionally crippled, not by accident, but by the quiet inheritance of unspoken pain. Through Freud's lens, we've walked through the hallways of repression, fear, abandonment, and longing. But we've also uncovered something far more powerful, the possibility of reconnection, not through perfection but through presence. Not by fixing the child, but by healing the adult who lives inside you. Because once we understand that behavior is biography in disguise, we can stop reacting and start responding with wisdom. The greatest tragedy is not that children are wounded, it is that they carry those wounds in silence, believing they are unworthy of love. But the greatest miracle is this: just one moment of being truly seen can undo years of unconscious hurt. And that moment begins with you. Not tomorrow, not when you're ready, now. With one conversation, one apology, one act of listening that says, "I'm here and I see you." That's how cycles end, and not with force but with truth. The truth that love without awareness is dangerous, but love with awareness is redemption. So here is the final question. Not for your child, but for you. What part of you still waits to be seen? Because that part holds the empathy your child needs. That part holds the wisdom no book can teach. And that part, once embraced, can break centuries of inherited silence. Perhaps this isn't a video about parenting. Perhaps it's about liberation. Yours, theirs, and everyone who comes after. Because when one person chooses to wake up, the whole lineage begins to breathe differently. If this message touched something deep within you, don't let it fade. Let it echo. Leave a comment sharing what spoke to your heart. Subscribe to join a space where we uncover the invisible and heal what was once unspeakable. Like and share this with someone whose child, or inner child, still waits for someone to truly listen. Because this is more than a video. This is a movement toward truth. And truth, once seen, changes everything.